Let's continue getting reaction with regards to the death of former President of Zimbabwe, Robert Mugabe. Let's go now to our senior political reporter, Mzondile Mbeje, and he's with the leader of the Democratic Alliance, Mmusi Maimane.
Well, thank you very much, Blaine. We continue the rolling coverage of the former president of Zimbabwe. Of course, he was a huge factor, not only in Zimbabwe, of course, in South Africa, as you've mentioned. With me is the leader of the official opposition in South Africa, the Democratic Alliance, Mr. Mmusi Maimane, who will give us his take on the death of the former president of Zimbabwe. Welcome, Mr. Maimane. We woke up to the news today of the passing on of former president of Zimbabwe. Your reaction as the DA?
First of all, I want to say to the people of Zimbabwe and certainly the continent at large, I send our deep condolences to the people of Zimbabwe and to the continent. Secondly, I think one cannot deny the role that President Robert Mugabe played in the contribution to the liberation of the people of Zimbabwe. And yet, equally so, it then became absolutely crucial that we recognize equally so that President Mugabe failed to build a capable state, failed to continue the project of liberation, and unlike President Mandela, failed to step down and uphold democracy. So in such a time as this, that we reflect on both, because it's important for the people of Africa to know that when we look at liberators, we also need to know that there must be life beyond liberators. We must liberate ourselves from liberators. And I think may his soul rest in peace, and ultimately let's ensure that the nation of Zimbabwe, as it mourns now, that it be comforted, but let's build a Zimbabwe that is prosperous, because ultimately the struggle for liberation was so that we build an Africa that is prosperous.
This happens when the country has been going through some of the attacks on foreign nationals. Some of those people from Zimbabwe who perhaps say they are here because there were issues they may have had with the former president.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's an indicator of what happens when liberators eventually turn into people who are dictators. They undermine human rights. They force citizens to leave their nations. And I think, as I said here today, I'm meeting with the leadership, the opposition, in the region, certainly with Malawi, and we'll be meeting with Zambia and Zimbabwe, to ensure that we stand up together and say, look, how do we ensure that we give rights to citizens, that we uphold human rights in all of these respective countries, that we live in a post-liberation era Africa, and that more than anything condemns xenophobic attacks in the region, because it isn't honoring in the spirit of building an Africa where the rights are protected and human rights are upheld. And so I think I stand here today recognizing with brothers and sisters in Zimbabwe, as I've always stood up for the people of Zimbabwe, to say in opposition we must oppose President Mugabe's government, because we want to build a stable Zimbabwe and ensure that the rights of human beings are brought together. And I'll continue the work that we've been working on in a post-liberation era.
Do you think this will bring any change to the people of Zimbabwe and of course to the people of the region and the continent?
Well, I think it's an indicator that as one generation of leaders who served during the liberation era, many of them are dying. President Mandela, President Mugabe. Now it's the time for a new generation of leaders to take the SADC region forward. And what I'd like to urge is that certainly in our engagements, it is said that President Mugabe had to even die in Singapore. Means the healthcare in Zimbabwe was dysfunctional. So we need to focus on the developmental issues in the region. How do we build economies that work? How do we build healthcare that works? How do we build education that works? And how do we ensure that human rights are going? So the change that the people of Zimbabwe must be able to see, as should the people of South Africa and Malawi and different parts, is that let's work together to build economies of the future and healthcare of the future, and education of the future, so that we bring that change that is required. So that is the work that we are engaged with, and certainly in the sidelines of WEF, my engagement with the leader of the opposition from Malawi has been that has been the focus of the conversation, and that's what we focus on.
Thank you very much. There was the leader there of the opposition, Mmusi Maimane. Of course, you heard him when he was speaking to say he's been meeting with some of his colleagues from the African continent, particularly the leader of the opposition in Malawi, Lazarus Chakwera, who is the leader of Malawi Congress Party. I mean, this is the issue of former President Mugabe really cuts across the African continent. And of course, he also would want to say something. Mr. Chakwera, this must be a difficult moment for the African continent.
Yes, indeed it is, because a giant has fallen, someone who not only fought for the liberation of Zimbabweans, but stood on a world platform to talk about Africa and how that Africa needs to be united. This is an elder that has fallen, which elders should have, as many have recognized, taken a side to actually encourage new liberators to forge ahead with the vision that he had and stayed too long. And so it's a lesson to all of us, even as we mourn him and as we condole Zimbabweans and all of Africa. We must face the hard facts of how we need to step aside when we need to, in order for the struggle to continue with more momentum that brings genuine change or transformation. And so, again, as part of Southern Africa, many of the struggles we face as people migrate from country to country, it's because we have not provided the kind of economic transformation for our own people. And in as much as we condemn all these xenophobic or Afrophobic tendencies and what has occurred in this country recently and is still occurring, we must understand the context and how that Africa continues to fight amongst itself instead of letting us united so we can develop Africa wherever we might find ourselves. I love South African anthem, Nkosi Africa. Bless all of Africa. It's not just South Africa. And that needs to be translated in a way that gives confidence to everyone on this continent that we are but one people.
So what do you think is the problem in these African countries, all of us, that leads to this kind of attacks, brother amongst brothers, sister amongst sister, particularly as someone who is in the opposition benches?
You see, when we do not consider contrarian views, even as we develop our philosophy, political philosophy or economic philosophy, we tend to create cliques who have now in their heart a certain amount of hatred because of certain unfulfilled promises. We need to face up to the fact that as people, we must be responsible to our people. If we run for office as politicians, we must be honest and be people of integrity, serving the interest of other people rather than our own. Create the jobs, create the environment in which true development can take place. But we must understand, we are human beings. If we are not accountable, we become a worst kind of enemy, or our own enemy. And so as leaders, we must educate our people to say we are but one people and we must live right, one with his neighbor.
Thank you very much, sir.
You're welcome.
That was the leader of the opposition in Malawi, Lazarus Chakwera of the Malawian Congress Party, basically also sharing his views and his thoughts about the passing on of former President Robert Mugabe, and of course weighing in on the developments playing in South Africa of the attacks that we have seen meted out against foreign nationals.
Mzondile Mbeje, live for us in Cape Town. Thank you very much indeed, getting us reaction with regards to the death of Robert Mugabe. You're also getting reaction on social media. We're asking the question on our question of the day here on the